An unbreakable city, a ruthless king, total destruction. How Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem. What turns a conqueror into a destroyer? Why did Solomon's temple turn to ashes? Strategy, revenge, pride, power. The truth behind the siege that changed biblical history forever, ignored prophecies, broken alliances, devastating famine. How Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem. A cautionary tale that still echoes today. And what can we learn from this catastrophe? Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Nebuchadnezzar wasn't just some impulsive conqueror. He was a brilliant strategist, a charismatic leader, and a man dead set on making his mark on history. The destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC was the climax of decades of political tension, rebellions, and ignored prophetic warnings. And the most surprising part, the biblical records show us that in some mysterious way, God was actually using this pagan king as an instrument for his greater purpose. Get ready for a fascinating journey behind the scenes of one of the most significant events in biblical history. You'll see that the fall of Jerusalem wasn't just a simple act of military conquest, but the result of a carefully crafted strategy, driven by deep motivations and consequences that still echo today. Are you ready to uncover the incredible reasons behind Jerusalem's downfall? How did one emperor come up with a plan so effective that he left no stone unturned in the city God had chosen? When we think about the fall of Jerusalem, most people picture just a straightforward military attack, but the reality was way more complex and calculated. Nebuchadnezzar, known as one of the greatest military strategists of the ancient world, came up with a multi-layered approach that mixed brute force with sharp psychological tactics, turning the art of war into a real science of destruction. The Babylonian army was a war machine like no other for its time. Fast cavalry, deadly archers, and well-trained infantry. But what really set them apart was the advanced siege engineering Nebuchadnezzar put into play. Mobile assault towers, powerful battering rams, and tunneling techniques to weaken city walls, all designed specifically to break through the defenses. Of fortified cities like Jerusalem, psychological warfare was another key part of his strategy. The Babylonians used intimidating shows of force, spread rumors about the horrors they'd committed in other conquered cities, and sent messengers to crush the defenders' morale. Just imagine the psychological impact when the people of Jerusalem saw the massive Babylonian army camped around their city with their flags, shining armor, and war machines no one had ever seen before. But maybe the cruelest part of Nebuchadnezzar's strategy was how he used starvation as a weapon. By completely surrounding the city and cutting off every supply route, he turned time into his ally, knowing that every passing day wore down not just the defenders' bodies, but their will to resist. Can you picture the growing desperation inside those walls as food ran out and any hope of rescue faded away? And behind all this relentless strategy, what were the real motivations driving the mighty king of Babylon? To truly understand Nebuchadnezzar's determination to destroy Jerusalem, we have to look past the military tactics and see the bigger geopolitical game of that era. Jerusalem sat in a crucial spot on the corridor connecting Mesopotamia to Egypt. Two superpowers fighting for regional dominance. Whoever controlled this route had a huge edge in trade and military campaigns across the region. Egypt, Babylon's eternal rival, had made alliances with several kingdoms in the area, including Judah. For Nebuchadnezzar, this alliance was a constant threat to his southwestern flank and a roadblock to his imperial ambitions. Every time Jerusalem rebelled against Babylon, it was basically declaring loyalty to Egypt, something the proud Babylonian king just couldn't tolerate in his quest for world domination. But there was something even deeper at play. A challenge to the pride and divine authority Nebuchadnezzar claimed for himself. He didn't just see himself as a conqueror, but as the representative of the gods on earth. Jerusalem's resistance, rooted in faith in one sovereign God, was a direct ideological and theological challenge to his authority. How could a tiny kingdom stand up to Babylon and its whole pantheon of gods? This insult to his imperial pride became personal for Nebuchadnezzar. In Babylonian inscriptions, he often bragged about subduing nations and their gods, folding them into his empire. But the God of Israel was different, invisible, not represented by any image, and his followers claimed he was above all other gods. Can you see how this spiritual resistance stoked the emperor's fury, and how this theological tension only got worse as the kings of Judah kept rebelling against Babylon's rule? The story of Jerusalem's fall didn't start with its final destruction. It actually unfolded in stages that got worse and worse, kind of like a storm that slowly builds up before it hits full force. At first, Nebuchadnezzar was cool with keeping Judah as a vassal kingdom as long as they paid tribute and swore loyalty to Babylon. That was a pretty standard deal in the ancient Middle East and allowed for some local autonomy under imperial supervision. But King Jehoiakim made the fatal mistake of rebelling against Babylon after just 3 years as a vassal, probably hyped up by promises of Egyptian support that never came through. Nebuchadnezzar didn't waste any time. He launched a punitive expedition that led to the first deportation of Jewish nobles and leaders, including the young Daniel and his friends, in 605 BC. That should have been a clear warning about what happens when you cross Babylon, but the lesson didn't stick. After Jehoiakim died, his son Jehoiakim and later his uncle Zedekiah kept up the resistance and tried to form anti-Babylonian alliances. Each rebellion was met with an even harsher response. The second deportation in 597 BC took another 10,000 people, including craftsmen, warriors, and the prophet Ezekiel. Nebuchadnezzar was still showing some restraint, leaving the basic structure of the kingdom and its temple intact. But the Babylonian emperor's patience had its limits. When Zedekiah, Judah's last king, broke his oath of loyalty and went running to Egypt for help again, Nebuchadnezzar made a drastic call. No more chances for Jerusalem. What started as a policy of control and vassalage turned into a sentence of total annihilation. Can you picture the moment when the emperor, furious over all the betrayals, ordered his generals to leave nothing standing in Jerusalem? And what was his plan to permanently crush the Jewish people's ability to resist? One of Nebuchadnezzar's most sophisticated and devastating tactics was the systematic and selective deportation of the Jewish population. Unlike other conquerors who just wiped out defeated peoples, the Babylonian king took a more calculated, pragmatic approach. He understood the value of human capital and knew exactly which segments of the population to remove to effectively dismantle a nation's ability to resist and rebuild. These deportations weren't random. Nebuchadnezzar specifically ordered the removal of Jerusalem's intellectual, political, and military elite. Priests, scribes, skilled craftsmen, warriors, nobles, and members of the royal family were carefully picked out and taken to Babylon. Among them were promising young people like Daniel, who would later become an advisor in the Babylonian court, and Ezekiel, whose prophetic visions would keep hope alive for the people in exile. This strategy had multiple goals. First, it got rid of natural leaders who could organize resistance. Second, it deprived Jerusalem of its craftsmen and specialists needed to keep up critical infrastructure like fortifications and water systems. Third, it created a Jewish elite in Babylon that could be useful to the empire with their knowledge and skills. It was a policy of human decapitalization that left behind only farmers and people without special skills. The psychological impact of this tactic was deep and long-lasting. Families were torn apart, bloodlines were broken, and traditions of knowledge were threatened. Imagine the collective trauma of watching the best and brightest in your community being chained up and dragged off to a foreign land. while those left behind faced an uncertain future with no real leadership. But even after 2 massive deportations, Jerusalem still held out. So what happened when Nebuchadnezzar's patience finally ran out, leading to the final siege that sealed the fate of the holy city? The 10th day of the 10th month in the 9th year of Zedekiah's reign marked the beginning of the end for Jerusalem. On this date, recorded with chilling precision in the Bible, the Babylonian army, led by Nebuchadnezzar himself, surrounded the city in a total lockdown. It wasn't the first time Jerusalem had faced a siege, but this time felt different. The relentless determination in the Babylonian soldiers' eyes and the sheer scale of the military operation made it clear. There would be no mercy. For 18 long months, life inside Jerusalem turned into a living nightmare. The stored food ran out fast, forcing people to take desperate measures. The Book of Lamentations and Jeremiah's writings describe horrifying scenes of extreme hunger, people eating anything they could find, leather, poisonous plants, and, in the most desperate cases, there are even reports of cannibalism. Water was rationed drop by drop, never enough, leading to dehydration and the spread of disease. Meanwhile, outside the walls, the Babylonians worked methodically. They built earthen ramps to move their siege engines closer, used battering rams to pound the gates non-stop, and had archers ready to take out anyone who dared show themselves on the walls. Every attempt at outside help was crushed. When the Egyptian pharaoh finally sent troops to help his ally, Nebuchadnezzar simply split his army, kept the siege going, and wiped out the Egyptians, crushing the defenders' last hope. On the 17th day of the 4th month in the 11th year of Zedekiah, after a year and a half of unimaginable suffering, the walls finally fell. Babylonian soldiers flooded into the city like an unstoppable wave, finding a population that was skeletal, sick, and too weak to fight back. King Zedekiah tried to escape with his sons and bodyguards under cover of night, but he was caught out on the plains of Jericho. Can you imagine the terror in his eyes as he was brought before Nebuchadnezzar, knowing the moment of final judgment had come? What happened next went beyond ordinary cruelty, even by the brutal standards of that era. The meeting between Nebuchadnezzar and Zedekiah at Riblah, in the land of Hamath, was staged as a spectacle of humiliation and terror. The Babylonian king, sitting on his campaign throne and surrounded by his generals in shining armor, stared down the captured king of Judah with a mix of contempt and vengeful satisfaction. What followed wasn't just punishment. It was a series of symbolic acts meant to show Babylon's absolute power and the utter futility of resistance. First, Nebuchadnezzar ordered Zedekiah's sons to be brought before him. One by one, the princes of Judah were executed while their father was forced to watch, powerless. Imagine the agony of a father seeing his children murdered, knowing his royal line was being wiped out right in front of him. This cruel act had a calculated purpose: to end the Davidic dynasty that ruled Jerusalem and erase any hope of future restoration. After witnessing his family's slaughter, Zedekiah faced his own terrible punishment. His eyes were gouged out. This was done so that the last thing he ever saw would be the death of his sons. Chained and blind, the last king of Judah was taken to Babylon, where he would die in captivity. The message was crystal clear to any ruler thinking about defying the empire. Disobedience wouldn't just mean defeat. It would bring total destruction and unimaginable suffering. Meanwhile, back in Jerusalem, Nebuzaradan, the commander of the Imperial Guard, oversaw the systematic destruction of the city. The main target was Solomon's temple, the spiritual heart of the Jewish nation. The Babylonian soldiers didn't just loot its treasures, they took the place apart, piece by piece. Bronze columns were cut up for transport, sacred utensils were catalogued and shipped off to Babylon, and finally, The sanctuary was set on fire. Can you feel the emotional and spiritual impact as flames devoured the very place where the Jews believed God's presence dwelled? And what happened to all the wealth that had been gathered over centuries in this city that was once the pride of a nation? After the walls fell and the king was captured, Jerusalem was picked clean in a meticulous, relentless looting. The Babylonian soldiers, experts in the art of pillaging, went methodically from house to house, palace to palace, with precise orders on what to look for and how to go about it. This wasn't some chaotic free-for-all. It was almost a scientific operation to transfer wealth, with scribes cataloging every valuable item for the imperial treasury. The gold, silver, and precious stones that had piled up over centuries of prosperity, going all the way back to Solomon's glory days, were carefully gathered up. Sacred artifacts from the temple, including the massive sea of bronze, held up by 12 metal oxen, the pure gold lampstands, the tables for the showbread, and hundreds of ceremonial utensils were taken apart when needed and packed up for the long trip to Babylon, where they'd be shown off as trophies of Nebuchadnezzar's victory over the God of Israel. But the looting didn't stop with material treasures. For the Babylonian soldiers, the surviving population was another resource to exploit. The atrocities committed against the people of Jerusalem are only hinted at in the Bible, but records of similar conquests in ancient times reveal the awful pattern that almost certainly played out. Mass rapes of women and girls, prisoners tortured, to reveal hidden valuables, and the brutal enslavement of the survivors. The women of Jerusalem suffered especially, as mourned in the biblical texts. Women in Zion were raped, virgins in the towns of Judah. This sexual violence wasn't just a byproduct of war's brutality. It was a deliberate policy of humiliation and domination. Families were forced to watch their loved ones being abused, creating trauma that would haunt generations. Can you imagine the despair and helplessness of those who survived the siege's starvation, only to face this kind of brutality? And what would become of the city that was once called the joy of the whole earth? The final act in Jerusalem's tragedy was its total physical annihilation. A month after the initial invasion, Nebuchadnezzar, the commander of the Imperial Guard, came back with specific orders to finish the job. The walls that had protected the city for centuries were systematically torn down, stone by stone, until nothing was left of their former grandeur. Palaces, homes, workshops, and public buildings were set on fire, turning the cityscape into a sea of ashes and blackened rubble. The destruction was so complete that when modern archaeologists dig through the layers from this period, they find a clear destruction layer, a dark band of ash and charred debris that silently testifies to the disaster's intensity. This wasn't just a military conquest, it was a deliberate attempt to wipe Jerusalem off the map and out of memory. The Babylonians believed that by totally destroying a city, they were also destroying the power of its gods, a theological statement as powerful as any military one. The depopulation was just as methodical. Those who survived the siege, the invasion, and the looting were chained together in long lines and forced to march hundreds of miles to Babylon. Only the poorest, those who owned nothing, as the Bible puts it, were left behind to work as vineyard keepers and farmers, making sure the land stayed productive for the empire. Jerusalem, once buzzing with tens of thousands of people, became a ghost town, inhabited by just a handful of devastated peasants. This catastrophe raised deep theological questions for the survivors. How could God allow such destruction of his chosen city and his own temple? The prophets, especially Jeremiah, offered a painful interpretation. The destruction was divine judgment for the sins of idolatry and social injustice that had spread through Judah. Nebuchadnezzar, in his arrogance, thought he was proving God's superiority. But from the prophetic point of view, he was just a tool in the hands of Israel's God, disciplining his own people. Have you ever wondered how a tragedy this devastating could paradoxically end up strengthening faith instead of destroying it? And what lessons can we take today from this catastrophic event that happened over 2,500 years ago? The destruction of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar wasn't just some distant historical event. It was a turning point that forever changed the Jewish faith and, by extension, shaped the Christianity that would emerge centuries later. During the Babylonian exile, far from the temple and their traditional religious structures, the Jewish people found new ways to hold on to their identity and faith. Synagogues started popping up, the scriptures were compiled and preserved with fresh passion, and the messianic hope for restoration got a whole new boost. This catastrophe teaches us about the consequences of ignoring repeated warnings and chances to turn things around. The prophets had spent decades warning about the coming judgment, but their pleas were consistently brushed aside by the leaders and the people. How many times in our own lives do we ignore warning signs, whether it's about our spiritual health, our relationships, or big decisions? The story of Jerusalem reminds us that there comes a point when consequences just can't be avoided anymore. Ironically, the destruction also showed God's faithfulness to his promises. Even in the middle of all that devastation, God kept a remnant safe, and 70 years later allowed them to return and rebuild. Just like Jeremiah promised, the exile wasn't the end of the story. It was a painful chapter in a much bigger story of redemption. That perspective gives us hope in our own moments of crisis and apparent defeat, that even in the darkest times, there's a bigger purpose at work. Today, as we look at the ancient ruins and the modern Jerusalem that's risen from them, we're invited to think about our own spiritual journey. Are we building our lives on solid foundations that can stand up to the storms that are sure to come? Are we paying attention to the Nebuchadnezzars of today, whether that's temptations, moral compromises, or worldly distractions that threaten to lay siege to and destroy our faith? The story of Jerusalem's fall challenges us to look at our own hearts and renew our commitment to the God who, even in judgment, never gives up on his plan for restoration and ultimate redemption. Just like the Jewish people found renewal after exile, our own lives can be restored after tough times. Maybe you're going through your own Babylonian siege right now. Just know you're not alone, and there's hope beyond the broken walls. If this message spoke to you, hit that like button so we can reach even more people with these life-changing truths. Drop the phrase "new beginning of a new covenant" in the comments so I know you really got the heart of this story. That God always offers a fresh start, even after the biggest falls. And if you're not part of our community yet, now's the perfect time to subscribe and turn on notifications. Together, we'll keep digging into the depths of biblical stories and what they mean for our lives today. Speaking of fascinating stories, have you heard the real truth about the cities that became a symbol of immorality? In our video, The Real Life in Sodom and Gomorrah, What Made the City So Corrupt, we reveal some surprising things that go way beyond what you've probably heard before. The link's in the description and on the card popping up on your screen right now. Don't miss this chance to take your Bible knowledge even deeper. Remember, just like Jerusalem was rebuilt after its destruction, God is always in the business of rebuilding and restoring our lives. Until the next video, may the peace of the Lord be with you.